Hello, students. Let's begin our examination of Topic 6, the Great Depression and the New Deal, a time period roughly 1929 to 1941, when the United States went from one of its most prosperous decades, the 1920s, when it was a leading industrial economy in the world, to an economic low point, the lowest depression we had ever been in, of the 1930s. And when we examine this, we want to ask ourselves a very important question and take away from this a very important lesson, which is why? Well, to begin with, the 1920s weren't nearly as prosperous as they appeared. Farmers continued to teeter on the brink of financial ruin as they had in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There was a short reprieve during World War I, but many farmers were still falling victim to the problem of overproduction, leading to rapidly dropping crop prices. World War I offered a short reprieve because the government put some strict high price controls on farm products, and there was an increased demand to feed the Allies in Europe as well as the United States' war effort. During this time, many farmers went further into debt, buying tractors and other farm equipment to help keep up with the demand. But when the war was over, the government removed those price controls. The demand dropped as the European governments were able to recover their agricultural economy relatively quickly, and farmers not only were back in the same problem of overproduction and low crop prices, but had additional debts that they were not able to pay off. In addition, the prosperity of the 1920s was not evenly distributed. There was a major wealth gap between the average worker and the top 1%. Worker production during the 1920s, thanks to the assembly line and other innovations, increased by about 32%. However, wages only went up about 8%. So where was all of this wealth going? Well, corporate profits exploded by about 65%. And the wealthiest 1% of Americans made roughly 50 times what workers made. The problem that comes about is that this production and workers' wages are not commensurate with each other, meaning workers weren't making enough money to buy all of the products that they were producing. And this is going to lead to underconsumption. So most of the wealth is going to a few people, but those few people aren't going to buy 50 times as many products. They're not going to buy 50 times as many cars or washing machines as the working class would do. And so if there were more money at the bottom in the working class, they are more likely to buy some of these products because they don't already have them. But since most of the money was being concentrated in the upper class, it just wasn't getting spent. It wasn't getting put back into the economy, and factories were starting to have to close down because they were having a glut of products and warehouses that were overflowing with unsold consumer goods. Now, the easy credit and installment buying of the 1920s partially hid the problem of the wealth gap, as many working class families were able to purchase products, but not outright. They would pay a little bit down and then pay a little bit every month for 12 months or so until they had paid off the product. However, this easy access to credit meant that many working families ended up going farther into debt than they could actually afford to pay off. And when we started to run into the problem of underconsumption and factories started to close down, many workers hadn't made enough money to have a decent enough savings to help them through this period of unemployment. And in addition, they had racked up some pretty hefty debts that they couldn't pay back. Stock speculation, which was also done often on a version of installment buying called buying on the margin, where the broker would forward most of the money and the person who actually purchased the stock would pay them a little bit at a time. And it was based on the idea that the stock market was going to continue to go up and up and up. The value of stock would continue to incline. And this just isn't the way the business cycle generally works. And so there was a flurry of buying, which actually inflated prices to an unnatural level. And when they started to decline to their actual real value, stock owners started to panic. And so they began to sell off. And when you start to sell stock, that tends to make the market go down. Prices start to go down because there's more people trying to sell stock than there are people trying to buy that stock. And when everybody started trying to sell off their stock, the stock market crashed. This is oftentimes referred to as Black Tuesday, and usually seen as sort of the beginning of the Great Depression, although if you asked farmers, they had been in a depression for a while. And with those stocks being bought on margin, many couldn't pay it off, and many people lost their fortunes in the stock market crash of '29. An over-reliance on the stock market and easy access to credit are going to play a role in the collapse of the United States banking system in the 1930s as well. Money in the bank is money that comes from depositors, people who put their money in a bank, in a savings account or a checking account, and then the bank then can loan out some of that money to other people. And in the 1920s, banks had been making riskier and riskier loans, to giving larger loans than many people were really able to pay off. In addition, many banks used a large amount of the money that depositors had put in the banks to play the stock market. And during that bull market of the 1920s, everybody just assumed stocks would go up and up and up. And then when the bubble burst in 1929, many banks stood to lose quite a bit of money. Now, they're still in business so long as depositors still have faith that the bank is going to stick around and be able to give them back their money. But with the stock market crash, many depositors started to get nervous again, and they came to get their money out. And this is fine, except that the bank doesn't always have all of everybody's money. It's in investments and it's out in loans. And normally this works just fine as long as not everybody comes to the bank at once. This is what's called a run on the bank. And if there is a run on the bank and the bank runs out of money, it collapses, it closes, it can no longer exist as a bank. And if you're one of the unlucky people who has not come to get your money out of the bank, you lose everything. There's nothing to guarantee your money once it has been placed in that bank. And so if you hear there's a run on the bank, even though you're not afraid of the bank collapsing, you know that might lead to a bank collapse, and that led a lot of other depositors to go to the bank and try to get their money out as well. And this then caused a panic and spiraled down into a full collapse of most of the banks in the United States. In addition, U.S. monetary policy is going to make the crash even worse. The Federal Reserve, the sort of central bank for the United States, can manipulate interest rates by putting more money out, loaning more money out to banks, or restricting how much money they loan out to banks. And during the 1920s, they had loaned out a lot of money to keep interest rates low. But when they started to figure the market was going to take a dip back down, and so the Fed started to limit the money supply, limit the loans they were giving out to banks to try and discourage lending by those banks, because they were afraid people were borrowing more than they could pay off. And then when everything started to crash, there wasn't enough money in circulation to cushion the stock market crash, and there wasn't enough money in circulation for the banks to pay back their depositors when these runs on the banks happened. Overproduction then, of course, from factories led to decreased demand, which led to layoffs of workers, and unemployed workers are going to buy less, which is going to lead to more factories closing. This creates a sort of downward spiral. One factory will close because it is overproduced, and those workers, not having any extra cash, aren't going to go out and buy things they don't need, which means that workers who might produce a product that these workers would have bought are going to get laid off from their factory as they close, and so on and so forth. And it continues spiraling down to the low point was in 1933, a full 25% of the workforce was out of work, even higher in some places, especially if you were African American. To try to protect American businesses and industry, the Hoover administration and Congress will pass one of the highest tariffs in U.S. history, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And this is going to damage international trade and only make things worse. foreign nations were unable to compete in the U.S. market and lost access to it because the tariff made their products so much more expensive than U.S. tariffs. There's two problems that are going to result from this. One, when foreign businesses cannot sell in the U.S. market, many of them close, and foreign workers can't afford American products that are being shipped overseas. In addition, many European countries, in retaliation for the Hawley-Smoot tariff, will pass tariffs of their own, which is further going to suppress international trade. The Depression then ripples out from the United States across the world and becomes a worldwide depression. European nations were unable to pay back their debts to U.S. banks accrued during World War I, and the international monetary system really had started to rely on debt to U.S. banks, which were now beginning to collapse. The Dawes Plan and other such things that came about from that. And this is going to fund or create an international crisis. To this day, economists and historians still debate the underlying causes of the Great Depression. Two of the most prominent theories are espoused by the two gentlemen you see on your screen right now. On the left is Milton Friedman, on the right, John Maynard Keynes. Milton Friedman argued for more of a single cause of the Depression, which he considered to be the contraction of the money supply by the Federal Reserve. That in response to the stock market crash and bank failures, the Fed did the exact wrong thing, which was to restrict the amount of money that was out there. That if more money had been in circulation, it could have cushioned the United States' dip in the normal business cycle of ups and downs in a capitalist system. So from Friedman's point of view, the federal government, through the Fed, was entirely too involved in the economy. On the right, John Maynard Keynes, his economic theory was that the United States government needed to be more involved. And Keynes is going to be more important to this discussion because it's his economic theory that's going to be followed by the Franklin Roosevelt administration in attempting to respond to the Great Depression. Keynes argues that more government regulations of the money supply, wealth distribution, consumer spending, overproduction, and unemployment should have been in place to deal with the problems of the 1930s. And if you recall, the 1920s were a laissez-faire economic policy time when a lot of those restrictions and regulations from the progressive era had been removed. And he argued that we should not have done that, and a more proactive government could have controlled those problems. Contrary to the belief of many of the more conservative politicians in the 1930s, Keynes argued that the government should not spend less money, should not cut spending in times of an economic downturn like the Great Depression, but what they should instead do is increase the amount of spending, particularly to keep people employed. Keynes argued more of a bottom-up economic theory, where more money at the bottom in the working class would jumpstart the economy because the working class were much more likely to buy products, which would get more factories opened back up, get more people back to work. Taking a look at the graphic organizer here, we have several issues that led to the Great Depression. And for each one of them, I want you to describe what it is and then also explain how it led to the Great Depression. So if we zero in on the first one, farmers' problems, we could summarize that many farmers went into debt buying equipment and leading to the overproduction of crops, and that then led to crop prices dropping, which then meant farmers couldn't pay off their debts, and this is going to contribute to the United States entering the Great Depression. All right, te amo, ciao.